Well, hello, everybody. Welcome to the Transformational Breath Work, also known as Advanced Pranayama class, with my dear friend and fellow yoga teacher, Mike Thacker. It is such an honor and such a privilege to have him lead this portion of the training for you guys. And I know that you are all in for a great experience. So Roger and I both really look forward to this series of workshops. So without further ado, give up some jazz hands for Mike Thacker.
Thank you. Albina, could you allow me to screen share?
You are now a co-host and you should be able to share a screen or whatever else you want to do.
Thank you. Can everyone see my screen?
We can see your screen.
All right. And can y'all see this ribbon on the right-hand side, or is that ribbon just visible to me?
I'm not sure what ribbon you're referring to.
Can you see a set of images with you on with your faces on there? Very much. And for those of you that don't know me, I will give a brief introduction and then we'll jump right into this. So I've been doing yoga for about 20 years. My original motivation was so I could get stronger, faster, more flexible for martial arts. When I got to 40, I got sick of being punched in the face and thrown on the ground. And so I started doing just pure yoga and stopped doing martial arts. 2012, I did the RYT with Roger and Albina, and it was a very transformational experience for me. And that kind of started my yogic journey. After that, I've done a lot of incredible trainings with a lot of teachers. And the most notable was when I trained with Wim Hof in 2017. Not only did I learn to do interesting parlor tricks like sit in ice and only take cold showers, but I also really learned a lot more about pranayama and breath than I had learned previously. And that probably has nothing to do with any of my previous instructors. It's just I needed the cold water to really get my attention and make sure I was fully focused on the power of breath. And then after that experience with Wim and the ice and the cold water, I decided I wanted to learn more. And so last year I trained with Stig Stevenson, and he has a program called Breathology. Stig is a 4-time world champion freediver. He trained in India with a lot of yogis that lived in caves and that are pretty serious about their meditation practices. And then when his freediving career ended, he went back and got his degree in medicine. And so training with him kind of got the yoga perspective on things, the performance athlete perspective on things, and then a lot of physiology about how breath works and the importance of breath. But I've kind of modified that content a little bit because there's parts that he emphasized that I don't think are quite as important or as interesting. And so in terms of our schedule for this evening, I have a few more minutes of introduction to go. We'll spend about 35 minutes talking about physiology and breath and about why it's important. Then we'll take a quick 10-minute break, and then we'll come back and do some pranayama. And I know a lot of this was already covered in your RYT 200, but if you were anything like me, you didn't really understand the value or the importance of it at that point. And so I'll reemphasize it. We'll do several exercises to get these breath work things ingrained in your body and in your mind at a deeper level, and allow you to ask some questions as we do some exercises. After we do all the breathing, we'll take a 10-minute break. We'll come back. I'll have you guys share, and then we'll talk about homework between now and the next time we meet on Wednesday, the 11th. And in case I forget to mention it, if you don't have pencil and paper with you, whenever we take your break, I certainly want you to grab it. But I see a lot of you already taking notes now, so you're probably ahead of me on that. And just to start moving forward. So, from my experience, both in my yogic and my pre yogic journey, I found there's 7 things that really facilitate happiness, health, and longevity more than anything else. The first is the intent and belief. And I've seen a lot of people that have very powerful intent, very powerful beliefs that didn't have the rest of this down. And they wound up recovering from some pretty significant illnesses and injuries. The next is the importance of quietness and stillness. Especially now, a lot of us have way too much time where we spend on social media, on TV, and with news. And one thing I found is the value of shutting all that off, even your favorite songs and your favorite movies, and just having time to be still. The next is the cleansing and fasting. One of the first workshops I ever did whenever I was an instructor at Yoga One is Albina and I did a cleansing and fasting workshop. And so this is something that's very important to me. And at the time I did my first cleansing and fasting workshop, I was purely focused on the food aspects of the fast and the cleanse. Since then, I've realized there's a lot more that we take into our body, that we take in via our eyes, via our nose, via our ears, that have a material impact on our health and our happiness. And so, though it's good to do a fast with food, it's also good to do a fast with the other things that your body is consuming, either visually, auditorially, olfactory. The next one is what we're going to focus on right now in these sessions, and that's the conscious breathing. The fifth one is the intentional movement. Sixth is eating more plants. And I know some people are very adamantly against going completely vegan, and I would never advocate that to anybody. But I think almost everybody could benefit by adding more plants to their diet. And the last is the hot cold exposure. In terms of how all this relates, in my experience with a conscious breathing, of these items, with the exception of the eating plants and the hot cold exposure, which you're pretty much on your own to experiment with those things, I've found the conscious breathing to be very instrumental and very beneficial. Anytime I set an intent, I try to reprogram beliefs. There's a level of stillness that comes whenever you hold your breath, when there's nothing occurring around you, and the only thing that's occurring inside of you is the beating of your heart. In terms of the cleansing and fasting, your breath is the way that you eliminate more toxins than any other method. So more than your normal elimination methods through your bowels, through your skin, through any other method, you eliminate more toxins through your breath. And the last is intentional movement. And the benefits of aligning your movement with your breath are immeasurable. And if you're not moving with your breath, in alignment with your breath, it's difficult to say that you are doing yoga. So just to move on to start talking about human physiology just a little bit. So there's basically 4 types of breathing. There is the diaphragmatic breathing, there's the thoracic breathing, and then there's the clavicle breathing. And the diaphragmatic breathing is what we want to be doing most of the time. And that's where our breath engages from our diaphragm. And then we fill up from our diaphragm, depending on how deep or how shallow we're breathing. It may just be a diaphragmatic breath. There may not be any movement in the thoracic cavity at all, and there may not be any noticeable movement in your clavicles. The second type, which is what most people do if you look at them closely, is they're breathing from their chest, and there's not a lot of movement from their diaphragm. And though this is a popular form of breathing, it's not a very efficient form of breathing, and it's also not a healthy form of breathing. And the last is the clavicle breathing, where you are using your upper portion of your lungs and you can see someone's clavicles moving. If you've ever been with somebody who's extremely ill or near death, you notice this type of breathing where it's just the upper lungs that are moving. There's virtually no movement in the diaphragm and minimal movement in the thoracic cavity. And my recommendation is the only time that the clavicle breathing should be done is if you are doing some type of full-on breathe up exercise, like maybe a Bhastrika exercise or something else, where you're getting ready for a prolonged breath hold. And so you want to use every muscle that you have available to you to breathe as deeply and fully as possible. And in terms of the proper way to breathe, again, it should always be initiated from the diaphragm. The chest should engage next. And again, if you are breathing, to do some type of breath hold exercise or some type of bellows breathing, then the clavicle breathing should be engaged after the chest and the diaphragm are fully engaged. Now, though pictures like this were all over my books when I did the breathology training with Stig Stevenson, I will not bore you guys too much with this, but I think the main thing I wanted to bring out here is just there's two types of cellular respiration. There's aerobic and there's anaerobic. And the aerobic occurs with the presence of oxygen. The anaerobic has no oxygen. And then the most important takeaway from this are the number of ADP molecules, which are your basic unit of energy that your cells consume, are produced as a result of this breath, of this cellular respiration cycle. And if you're doing an aerobic cellular respiration where you have oxygen, you produce 38 ADP molecules. If you're not having oxygen and your body's producing energy without the presence of oxygen, you only produce 4. So you're burning up the same level of calories. The difference is you're producing a much lower level of oxygen. So as a result of this, you're going to build up a lot more lactic acid. So whenever you're exercising and you're sore after you're exercising, it's because you're doing quite a bit of anaerobic work during your exercise. Lactic acid is building up in your system and you're sore afterwards. The easiest way to relieve this is make sure you're breathing deeply and breathing fully while you're exercising, and that will reduce the amount of soreness. Having said that, I've been practicing this for many years, and I realize there's sometimes I breathe much better than others, and there's sometimes that I'm not breathing so well and I feel it the next morning. This is just another picture on the citric acid cycle, the Krebs cycle, and just how we produce ADP in the absence of oxygen. And again, the main thing is you produce 38 ADP molecules during cellular respiration whenever you have oxygen versus only 4 when you don't. The next major important concept about breath is you have 2 parts of your autonomic nervous system. You have a parasympathetic and you have a sympathetic portion of your autonomic nervous system. Your breathing controls which section of your autonomic nervous system you're in. If you're breathing very shallow, very rapid breaths, that'll instantly put you into a sympathetic mode. And there may be some times that it's okay to be in a sympathetic mode. If there's something that requires a true fight or flight reflex, then you probably want to engage your sympathetic nervous system. You want adrenaline and cortisol dumped into your system to get that extra energy, to get that extra strength. Unfortunately, most people spend too much time in their sympathetic nervous system. And a lot of the chronic conditions that people try to address using medication are chronic conditions that are a result of having that constant drip of cortisol and adrenaline in your system, which causes a huge imbalance. Your body is meant to deal with stress for short durations of time and short bursts. Your body is not meant to deal with continual dumping of cortisol and adrenaline into your system. One of the exercises, or several of the exercises we're going to be doing tonight, are to help you relax more deeply and feel a shift as you go from more of a sympathetic to a parasympathetic mode. And on the picture on the right, it kind of talks about all the physiological things that happen as your body moves into that sympathetic state, and that cortisol and adrenaline get dumped into your system, which again is a very useful thing if you have to escape from a burning building with your children, if you have to escape from any type of situation. It's very good to have that. But again, it's not something you want in your everyday life. And one of the big challenges that leads to many chronic conditions are the fact that too many of us spend too much time in that sympathetic mode and not enough time in the parasympathetic mode. Again, the way you move into a parasympathetic mode easily and quickly is through the breath. The longer, the slower you exhale, the more you're signaling your body you're okay, you're safe, and you can relax. By doing these long, slow exhales, you reduce your heart rate, you improve your digestive function, and you begin to relax your body. And if you do it long enough, you'll get your body so relaxed you can easily go to sleep afterwards. I'll come back to this slide because I was in a hurry and I must not have put it in the right order. So we already talked about the three types of breathing: the diaphragmatic, the thoracic, the clavicular. And then the shallow, rapid breathing engages the sympathetic nervous system. And even if you do deep, rapid breathing, where anytime your inhale is much more pronounced than your exhale, it's an engagement of the sympathetic nervous system. And again, the speed of the breathing, the depth of the breathing results in how much you engage your sympathetic nervous system. And again, we'll play around with some of this in the breath exercises so you can feel the different experiences. And then by having a long duration exhale, that'll engage your parasympathetic, which will slow your body down. Any question? Well, my apologies. Let me just keep on going for a little bit. The next thing is the sympathetic versus the parasympathetic. I've read a lot about various training mechanisms and what they recommend. And what I've come across is a lot of experts recommend no more than 2 hours a day in a sympathetic mode. And I would say if you're not doing any kind of serious training, I would even question, is 2 hours is too much? But the target is no more than 2 hours in a parasympathetic mode or sympathetic mode a day. Spend the remaining 22 hours in a parasympathetic mode. The sympathetic mode is very appropriate if you're going to the gym, if you're exercising, if you're taking a brisk walk after work to kind of relieve the stress, especially those that are working from home, or if you just had something occur and you need to shake that energy out of your body or move that energy out of your body, then doing some parasympathetic work or some sympathetic work, completely appropriate and very beneficial. And then the rest of the time should be in your parasympathetic mode, where your body's in the healing, the resting state. Because we're going to be doing some breath holds later, I want to spend a little bit of time just talking about CO2 and what CO2 is. So a lot of people have this perception that CO2 is bad, and certainly an excess quantity of CO2 is absolutely horrible, and there is toxicity that occurs in the body from CO2. Most people don't have that problem. They have the exact opposite problem. They have too little CO2 in their system. as a result of the low levels of CO2 in their system, their heart rate's faster than it needs to be, their blood pressure is higher than it needs to be, because CO2 is a vasodilator. And the more CO2 you have in your system, again, up to a certain point, the more your arteries and veins will expand. And obviously, the bigger the pipe that you're pushing the liquid through, the lower the pressure is in the pipe, and the fewer times the heart needs to beat to put pressure through the pipe, because you're pushing a larger volume through with every pulsation of your heart. And so again, we'll do some exercises to play around with increasing your CO2 level. The urge to breathe is based on the CO2 building up in your system. And most people don't have a very high CO2 tolerance. And so they're breathing significantly more than they need to breathe, which again results in higher heart rate, higher blood pressure. And there's other physiological things that happen too as a result of the high blood pressure and the high heart rate. And so by slowing down the number of breaths that you're taking, allowing your CO2 to build up in your system, not only does it allow you to do interesting party tricks like hold your breath for 5 minutes or more, it also allows you to become stronger and healthier. And then the
So
last.
Mike, this is Roger.
Yes, Roger.
Just a quick question. Just there's some really important stuff, and I want to re-emphasize that, and that most of us, what you were saying is most of us spend most of our time in that fight or flight mode, way too much time. And what you're saying is like 2 hours a day would be okay, right? But the other 22, you should be relaxed, right? And like rest and digest. But
yes, thank you very much, Roger, for stopping me.
A lot of us have it backwards, right? We're in fight or flight all day from the minute we wake up to the minute we go to sleep. We're in high stress mode. And so part of this work is to kind of start to change that, to get us out of that high stress, fight or flight, cortisol producing that's actually killing our cells, right? And flip it around. And what I also heard you say, and the quickest way to do that is with breath work. And then the other thing I heard you say, which was counterintuitive, is that the need to breathe a lot isn't caused by having too much CO2. Actually, we can have more CO2. It's not a bad thing. It's just that we can't tolerate the level of CO2 that we have. So we have low tolerance. So we have to be able to increase our tolerance to it, which will expand our vasodilators, all of our capillaries, and all the things to allow our blood pressure to go down, because we were going to be widening out opening up all those tubes. So that's actually pretty counterintuitive in a way, right? We think carbon dioxide is bad. We're not supposed to have it. It's okay. It's not bad for us at all. It's just that we don't have a high tolerance to it, right? And so we overbreathe, and that causes us to have short, shallow breaths, and it causes us to be in fight or flight, and it causes us to be sick, ultimately, is what you're saying, I think.
Great summary, Roger. Thank you.
Yeah, I just wanted to put it in kind of layman's terms. It's kind of like we're stressed out and causing ourselves to be sick by not breathing deeply.
Right. And now to go into something that's even more counterintuitive. So whenever I started learning how to hold my breath, and I started training with all these guys who were also learning to hold their breath and free dive and everything, I would have thought the people that were athletic, who were breathing the fresh mountain air, would be the ones that could hold their breath the longest. And eventually, after training, that was the case. But initially, the guys who could hold their breath the longest were the ones that were still smoking or had recently stopped smoking. And there was a guy from Australia, and this was back in 2019 when Australia was on fire with all these wildfires, and he was breathing in all this smoke.
Yeah.
And whenever you first start learning to breath hold, it has nothing to do with your lung capacity. The first thing is starting to override that urge to to breathe. And the guys who could go the longest and initially were the ones who were used to having the high CO2 in their system because they're breathing in smoke from the wildfires, they're smoking, and so they're breathing in cigarette smoke all the time. So they naturally have a higher CO2 tolerance than somebody who's used to breathing fresh air all the time.
So interesting. All right, sorry, keep going, please.
Thank you. So, and again, the last part of this is breathing should be divided into 4 cycles. And too often people are just doing cyclical breathing. And there are some exercises we are going to do that are cyclical breathing, and for durations, for short durations, just like we were talking about the being in sympathetic mode, cyclical breathing is fine, but cyclical breathing should not be the way you're breathing on a daily basis. Your breath should have 4 parts. It should have your active inhale, you should pause, you should exhale, and you should pause. And I think the average person takes somewhere around 30,000 breaths or more a day, and they're breathing about 12 breaths a minute. The goal is to get that down to about half. And there are a lot of people that are breathing much more than 12 breaths a minute. And again, we'll play around with that and see how much all you guys breathe, if you can actually just breathe normally and count your breaths. But once you start being conscious of inhaling, pausing, exhaling, and pausing, then it gets a lot easier. And I know I just put a lot of stuff out there, and I know Roger did a great job of interrupting me and talking through some of it. Does anyone have any questions or anything that we'd like to talk about the topics we've just covered before we move forward?
I do have one question just about how structurally, well, I guess either how like a deviated septum, does that manipulate all of this in a way that like totally throws someone off, or is it possible to still breathe efficiently, fully with a structural issue?
That's a great question, Sonia, and I think it depends, like everything. It depends on, are you capable of doing the Nadi Shonin, where you have the alternate nostril breathing? And if you're capable of doing that, then I would say it's not that impactful. If there's one nostril that you're not capable of breathing out of, then absolutely. But if you can do the alternate nostril breathing and feel that you're getting sufficient air through both nostrils, it's not that impactful. And there is, I'm trying to remember what the name of the study was, and I don't remember the details of the study, but I know James Nestor, and I can't remember the name of his book. He wrote a book on breath recently, and he was talking about the deviated septum and the impacts of the deviated septum. And just by breathing correctly and deeply, there were a lot of people that minimized the impact of that deviated septum.
Is that how you spell the name? James Nestor in the chat?
Yeah, James Nestor. And I'm, now that you've said that, I need to look it up. So in the break, I'll look up the name of his book. He did the talk show circuit not long ago. He was with Joe Rogan, and him had a pretty good conversation about 3 or 4 months ago. Any other questions or anything else anybody has?
I have a very quick question, and please forgive me if I'm rehashing what we've already spoken about. But something I often say in my class is that by us most of the time shallow breathing, I often say that we're starving ourselves, and like I believe Roger and you both said, slowly we're just really killing ourselves off. But I think I have a little bit of confusion around the shallow breathing and that mix of CO2 levels. May I ask you to clarify that for me again? I'm so sorry.
No apologies at all, Annie. Thank you. Thank you for asking that question, because yeah, it does get confusing. most people I know that have done shallow breathing also breathe rapidly.
Right.
I haven't met anybody who is doing shallow breathing, who's breathing very slowly. And
Yes.
so the challenge is whenever you're breathing rapidly like that, that is engaging your sympathetic nervous system, that's causing that constant drip of cortisol and adrenaline. And I would argue that shallow, rapid breathing, that's really not that effective. If you have to fight a tiger, I don't think you're going to be that strong. Or if you have to outrun a tiger, I don't think you're going to be that fast if you're breathing very quickly and very shallow. I think that if you're going to do that, I think that some deep, powerful, rapid breaths are going to help you a lot more and serve you a lot more as you're dumping that adrenaline into your system.
But I feel like it's just everybody's so busy that we're forgetting to do this long, slow breath. Everybody is so busy doing. And so is it that I guess my confusion is I understand that the shallow breath and the sympathetic and parasympathetic, it's the CO2 levels that I would like for you to clarify for me.
Okay, so by breathing rapidly, and we will do some of these breathing exercises, you're blowing off your CO2.
Okay.
So as you're breathing in, you're blowing, so you're not letting it build up, you're blowing it out as quickly. So you're pulling in oxygen quickly, you're blowing out CO2 quickly.
So it's the lack of it. It's the
lack of it, yes.
And what we want to do to take us from sympathetic into parasympathetic is to increase the CO2.
And you don't even, the CO2 isn't even necessary for that. What's necessary for that, or at least all the studies I've been reading, it's the exhale. It's the duration of the exhale that's the most important. Okay. So have your exhale at least the same duration as your inhale, preferably a longer duration. And again, we'll play with that and this evening, and we'll start to notice the longer we exhale, the more relaxed you get. And again, it's like everything, where initially you're going to have to resist that temptation because your body's going to say, "What are you doing, Annie? Give me some air. I got no air."
Okay, so it's the retention is saturating.
Yes, the retention. So if you're familiar with Wim Hof breathing, something that I didn't realize until I started doing a lot more study about this, you're not pulling in a bunch of oxygen as you're doing those deep inhales and those exhales. What you're doing is you're bringing a lot of oxygen to your system and you're blowing off all your CO2. As the CO2 starts to build back up in your system, then all that oxygen starts getting absorbed and utilized. So you're really not oxygenating your system that much by doing the breathing. It's as you're going for the breath hold, then the oxygen really starts sinking in, and it takes a while for the CO2 to build back up.
Okay, I think I understand.
So, Mike, Victoria had a question in the chat. She said, is it accurate that the pause after active inspiration, so active inhale, is where we get the buildup of CO2? So is it the pause when the CO2 builds up?
Absolutely. Yep. Thank you for that, Roger. Thank you for that clarification. Basically, yeah, the pauses are when the CO2 builds up, and when you're especially going to feel it is this pause, that pause in 6D is when you're going to start feeling it the most. And it is the habit where you're used to having all this oxygen in your system. Most people are used to way more oxygen than they need, just like many people are used to consuming way more food than they need. And so the objective is start understanding how much oxygen you really need to be pulling in on a regular basis and start reducing that to what's the absolutely minimum efficient level. And Roger, how can I look at the chats? Because I'm trying to understand
so
how to,
Mike, when you're talking, when we're chatting and just having a discussion, you should probably take it off screen share.
Okay.
And then you'll see all the chat and all that stuff. And then maybe just by scroll, like when you move your cursor. So if you just take it off of the screen share altogether, like stop sharing.
Got it.
Then you'll see you'll see everyone, and then you'll see, and when you move your cursor down to the bottom, you ought to be able to see the chat. Yeah, so now we can see your face, And
Okay.
then down at the bottom, you can see the chat, and you'll see like little numbers of how many chats haven't been addressed.
Thank you, Roger. I appreciate that.
And then Annie had another question.
So Victoria, was your question been answered, or is there still anything you'd like to add to this?
No, that was just kind of piggybacking off of Annie's question. The CO2 buildup is a separate issue from the parasympathetic sympathetic nervous system issue, but they're kind of both solved by the slowing down of breath and the holding of breath in between, correct?
Absolutely, Victoria.
Thank you very much.
And then the other quick question was, on a normal day when you're shopping at HEB and you're driving your car and you're not sitting on a meditation cushion and really focusing and playing with the breath, that pause, are we talking like a float up, hold it for maybe 3-4 seconds and then exhale? I mean, when you're going around your normal day.
Right. So I'm going to steal a little bit from what I was going to talk about related to Ujjayi and move that up here because I think that's going to help. So after I did my first teacher training with Roger and Albina, I went back to work after 10 days and I was walking around the halls at the office where I worked and I was doing Ujjayi breathing. And I don't know if that's an experience any of the rest of you have had. And I noticed I started doing it all the time, like almost always I was doing Ujjayi breathing. And then when I was training with Stig, it was a Forrest Gump moment where somebody asked him when you should be doing Ujjayi breathing. And he's like, when you get up in the morning, when you go to the restroom for the first time, whenever you're making your breakfast, when you're reading the news, and just the list just goes on and on. So it's not just when you're doing yoga, you should be doing your Ujjayi breath anytime you're conscious. And so to your point, Annie, ideally it depends on what you're doing. So if you're sprinting, your Ujjayi breath is going to look very different than if you're sitting on your couch reading a book. And back to the whole, as you're going through HEB doing shopping, if you're in good health, I would say maybe a 4-second inhale, a 4-second pause, a 4-second exhale, a 4-second pause. So you have a 16-second breath, and of those 16 seconds, only 4 seconds of it is your actual inhale, and the other 12 seconds is either your exhale or your pauses. And
I have a question.
yes, Kim.
So can you say one more time how much is the level of the CO2 and how much is our tolerance to the level of the CO2, and maybe how that might relate to a metabolic acidosis or alkalosis, or if it even gets that far?
No, absolutely. And that's an excellent question, Kim. So hopefully I'm not going to bore you by going into too much detail about it, but I'll just try to go in a little bit. And I wish I would have drawn a picture, or found a picture somewhere on this. So when I really started getting interested in the breath holding, I realized like this is the level where something dangerous happens because you're not breathing. This is the level that most people have where they have so much CO2 in their system, they can't tolerate it anymore. And so you have this safety mechanism here between the time the CO2 gets so bad or gets so high, you can't tolerate it anymore, to the point where something dangerous happens. And then as you start training yourself to deal with more and more CO2 level, then that gap closes. And one of the dangerous things about the Wim Hof breathing, and there were 3 people that died or drowned practicing that, is if you're practicing intentionally, you'll start to realize as you're moving closer and closer to the gap between when the CO2 level builds up to such a, or I should say when your tolerance for CO2 builds up to such a degree that you're almost at the danger zone, versus if you just do a bunch of hyperventilation and blow out all your CO2, you'll get there very quickly without the proper amount of training. And so it may seem like a good thing because you can hold your breath for a long period of time by doing that. It's not a good thing because you're very close to that danger zone. And if you push it just a little bit, your body's natural reflex, especially when you're holding your breath, is to pass out. If you're doing this on your couch, not a big deal. You wake up, no adverse impacts. You can do that every day if you want to. If you're 20 foot under the water and you pass out, it becomes a significant issue at that point. And so back to the whole acidosis point of it, there's no way you're going to be able to hurt yourself by doing this, because whenever the CO2 builds up too much, when the oxygen gets too low and you're intentionally holding your breath, your body is just going to override your brain and pass out. And the first thing you're going to do is you're going to take a breath. And so there's no way you're going to move yourself into some kind of dangerous acidosis state just by doing the breath. Now, if you're sitting in a garage with a car running and the garage door is down, you could get to that point. And so you don't want to do that. But just naturally practicing the breath hold, you will not get to that level. Does that answer your question, Kim?
I think so. Thank you.
All right. And Cindy, I like that. The silence between musical notes, the pause between the breath creates the flow. All right. Anybody else have anything before we go forward? All right, guys. Let me screen share again.
Mike, I just wanted to make a kind of an observation. There's this book. Well, there are these Tibetan sutras called the Radiance Sutras,
Mm-hmm.
and they talk a lot about the breath, really. And it's kind of like a poetic summation of how the breath is the source of life,
Mm-hmm.
and it says in the Radiant Sutras, you can look them up. It's a little red book, and this guy named Lauren Roche made the translation. It's a little tiny red book. It's beautiful, little poetic book. And it says that in the pause between the inhalation and the exhalation, all of existence, all of the meaning of life can be found if you'll just focus on that space. And so it's talking about obviously a deep focus and a deep, like, meditative sort of trance-like focus on that space. But in that space, everything can be realized. Like, in that space, self-realization, the meaning of life, all of existence, everything in that space between that pause between inhale and exhale, there's that little turn. And so, it's saying, like, it's a big deal, in other words, right? And like, we kind of just ignore it. It just happens naturally, right? But if you'll meditate on it, if you'll focus on it, and Mike's, this is where it starts to get interesting, as Mike has spent a lot of time playing in that space. So we get to play there with you. So that's really cool. I'm excited.
No, that's awesome, Roger. Thank you for sharing that. I had never heard of the Radiant Sutras before, but now I've written them down. I'll go look those things up.
Yeah.
All right. Anybody else have anything before I go back to the screen share? And so as I started going deeper and deeper into the world of breath, I kept coming across things about flow state and how you use your mindset and your breath to get into flow state. So if there's anything that's really key about breath, that is the fastest, easiest way to move into flow state. And for those of you who have done some research or familiar with flow state, there's a group called the Flow Genome Project. They've done a significant amount of research about being in flow state. The three most interesting things they've looked into learning and people who are in flow state. And I should go and give I'll give a quick definition of that in a moment. But people who are in flow state, they learn over twice as fast. The US military has been using the flow state for decades to train snipers and to train other elite forces operatives in half or less of the time that it took to whenever they were not moving people into flow state before they started the training. They've done a lot of research on the adrenaline athletes, specifically snowboarders and rock climbers, and their peak performance, especially when they're doing something that is considered to be impossible or never before done, they're always in flow state. And one of the interviews that one of the researchers in the Flow Genome Project was doing is somebody was asking about, so they watch these snowboarders go from like jumps of 40 yards to jumps of like 100 or 240 yards over a period of a couple of years. And the question was, well, how do you know these guys making these 240-yard jumps on a snowboard are in flow state? And the response was, the ones that weren't in flow state wound up in the hospital, because you're not able to physically perform at that level if you have all that noise in your head. And flow state is being able to just myopically focus on what's happening in the moment. And again, like the definition here says, a mental state in which you're pulled forward by big goals, you're happy where you are in the now, and there's a feeling of growth and a feeling of being lucky. I've done some training in the Silva method in the last few months while we were all in lockdown. And the Silva method is all about moving into flow state. And I'd done a lot of reading and a lot of listening to Joe Dispenza prior. So I was very familiar with the brain waves and the brainwave patterns. I wasn't really aware of how they map to flow state until I really started doing the Silva method. And in terms of brain waves, you basically have 5 different types of brain waves. Where we're at right now, this is beta. This is our normal conscious state of awareness. The level right below that is alpha. This is when you're just relaxing at the end of the day, reading a book, watching TV, you're completely chilled out. Your brain is not actively engaged. Your brain is very passive, and you are immersed in what you're doing. Theta is right before you pass out to sleep. Delta is a deep sleep. And gamma is where the magic happens. That is a hyperactive brain state. So beta is where we normally are. We move to alpha as we start unwinding for the day. We move to theta as we're moving into sleep. Delta is sleep. And then gamma is whenever we are hyper-focused, performing cognitively at a very high level, doing something very intellectually challenging. And for Joe Dispenza's research, a lot of people that had spontaneous healings, that was in the gamma state. What we're interested now here is the alpha and theta state. Those are the states that you can use your breath to move into. These are the states that they've noticed that the high performance athletes, the people who are learning at accelerated levels, they move from this beta state into this alpha or theta state to accelerate their physical performance, their ability to retain information, their ability to absorb and understand new information. And the exercises we'll be doing this evening, some of them will be helping move you guys into alpha and theta states. And this is just another slide with alpha and beta, alpha and theta. Alpha and theta are the two brainwave states that people move into that are considered flow states. Alpha is easier to access, and almost all of you should be able to access alpha with the breathing we do this evening. Some of you who have a lot of meditation practice can probably move into a theta state during some of our activities later on this evening. And back to what we were talking about, where we were talking about sympathetic, parasympathetic. When we start moving into alpha and theta states, and you start being in alpha and theta states for longer durations during the day, you naturally start moving from that sympathetic to that parasympathetic mode. This is not the best slide, but I couldn't find one that I really liked. And this one has a lot of good information on it. There's work by, I think his name is Stephen Porges, on polyvagal theory. And he started talking about there's two components of the parasympathetic nervous system. One is called dorsal vagal, that is your emergency state where you're absolutely in freeze mode. And that's the part of your sympathetic system or parasympathetic system you want to stay out of. And then there's the ventral vagal, which is the good part of your sympathetic nervous system you want to be in. And the ventral vagal, you're joyful, you're in the present moment, you feel grounded, you feel a sense of curiosity and openness, you feel compassion, you're mindful of what's going on around you. And then I know we talked a little bit about the sympathetic, but you have the fight or flight response in the sympathetic. And then in the dorsal vagal, this is where you reach a complete overwhelmed state and you freeze. And your body is literally, you've signaled your body that there's no fight or flight that is going to be possible to get you out of the situation. The only thing you can do is just shut everything down and hope for the best, because there's nothing you can do to move yourself out of this. I would say this is the ultimate victim state whenever you get into freeze. And so even though we've been talking a lot about parasympathetic, I want to emphasize that all the aspects of the parasympathetic are not necessarily good aspects of the parasympathetic. And by your breathing, you can stay in this state most of the time. You can control when you go into this state, and you can minimize or eliminate your time in that freeze state. And I know I just threw a lot of stuff out at you guys. Any questions about flow state, about the introduction of the dorsal vagal, sympathetic, and ventral vagal? And I'm going to stop sharing just to make sure.
Talking about the vagus nerve?
Yeah, absolutely, Roger. It's related to the 10th cranial nerve, the vagus nerve. That's absolutely correct.
Mm-hmm.
And Ashley, the book, The Rise of Superman, that was written by one of the guys who was part of the Flow Genome Project.
It was amazing. It talked about all the different sports, and then how they took it from all of the young athletes, and they were trying to figure out how they had a logarithmic scale rather than a linear scale, like golf, like track, like everything. And then they actually took the same breath work to the CEOs of Google and Apple, and how they had the flow mindset there. And it kind of changed a lot of things that I did.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing that, Ashley. So you're very familiar with this then? All right. Any other comments, questions?